All right, guys. So I had a really great conversation with Laurie Calhoun of the Libertarian Institute. You know her because she's been in several episodes of my show before. A really great person, very good philosopher, great writer, senior fellow of the Libertarian Institute. Laurie Calhoun is just great. And she has a brand new book out called Questioning the COVID Company Line, Critical Thinking in Hysterical Times. The book is fantastic. I read it and I sat down and had a very long conversation with her about it. The conversation was almost 2 hours long, which was great. And her time was so generous. Given to me for this episode, and I want you guys to be able to hear all of it, but I decided that I was going to break it up into 2 weeks. So in the first week, we're going to talk about several really important concepts that she outlines in her book regarding the relationship between the COVID crisis and the military-industrial complex, the slogan, trust the science, how the medical industry works, and so much more. So it's going to be a great episode, and this is going to be part one of two. So next week, you're going to have to come back and listen to the second half of the conversation. I know you're going to love it. So without any further wasting of your time, let's go ahead and get into the first part of my conversation with Laurie Calhoun on her brand new book, Questioning the COVID Company Line. This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is once again Laurie Calhoun. Laurie is a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute and the author of several great books, some of which we've talked about on the show before, including the brand new Questioning the COVID Company Line, Critical Thinking in Hysterical Times, which we will be discussing on the show today. Laurie, welcome back to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hello, Alex.
Hey, so this book is fantastic. Before we start, what motivated you to write Questioning the COVID Company Line?
That's a good question. I did not set out to write a book on this topic, but I was abroad in 2020, and I was contacted at the time by the director of the Libertarian Institute, Scott Horton, who invited me to contribute actively to the Libertarian Institute. And I was just basically trying to figure out what was going on with the COVID situation. And I was like, wow, this is what I should do. I should just start, trying to investigate this on my own. So I started writing essays. So I started in 2020 writing essays. And as the situation evolved, I just kept writing more and more and more. And then it ended up being 26 essays. And I decided to publish it as a book, not as like a victory lap, like, look, I was right and all of you naysayers were wrong, whatever, but rather as a cautionary tale for the future, because I think there are a lot of lessons we have to heed going forward.
Yeah, and the title of your book is really important. So the title is Questioning the COVID Company Line. There's a lot of words that are packed into that. And then the subtitle, I think, is just as equally important, which is Critical Thinking in Hysterical Times. What made you choose the title and the subtitle for this book? What's significant about it in terms of the argument that you make?
Okay, sure. The COVID company line, first of all, questioning. That was what I was doing the entire period of the pandemic. I was questioning what was going on. I would constantly come up against contradictions and try to figure out what was going on and try to resolve the bizarre policies that were being enacted and the behavior of people. I was trying to understand what was going on. So that was the questioning aspect. I'm a naturally skeptical person. I ask questions about everything. And this was ripe for investigation. And then the company line emerged as the COVID company line emerged as it became clear that there were financial forces whose interests were being promoted by the way in which the pandemic was managed by politicians. As far as critical thinking in hysterical times, I was really shocked at the response that I got to some of my essays early on by people who were very angry that anyone would deviate from the official narrative or even ask questions about it or even raise scientific objections to some of the policies. And I realized that people had been whipped up into a state of frenzy and in some cases hysteria through the political handling of the pandemic. So I felt like it was created, this environment of hysteria was created through the political policies enacted in response to the appearance of the virus on the scene. So the critical thinking is, okay, so hold on. There are a lot of emotional, angry people out there. Let's look at the facts and reason through what's going on. So critical thinking is the basic examination of policies and theories by appeal to logic. So I kept bumping into contradictions, and I was like, I have to figure out what is going on here. And so that's critical thinking applied to people who were like screaming at each other, who had no reason really to be angry at each other. But I saw this everywhere I went.
Well, a lot of the work that you've done up to this point has been on the military and the military-industrial complex. And the first time that I had you on the show, actually, we discussed the military-industrial complex and how that works. And one of the overarching themes in your book that you kind of refer back to over and over again in a lot of these chapters is that the same set of financial incentives and the same methods of propaganda that are used to support the military-industrial complex were also used by governments around the world to support their COVID policy. So kind of walk us through that argument. In what ways is the military-industrial complex similar to what we saw with the way that COVID policy unfolded?
Okay, what has emerged is a time-tested template for how to implement sometimes very radical policies with the acquiescence of the populace. And the template involves, the first step is fear of death. So you have to have a widespread fear of death. And when people fear their own personal demise and that of their families, they are willing to defer to quote unquote experts or authorities who are allowed to do whatever they want. And then, so they, in the case of post 9/11, they waged the war on terror, killed like more than 1 million people, wrecked the lives of many more. And all of this was done in response to the attacks of 9/11 when 3,000 people were killed. So it was complete overkill, literally and figuratively. But people went along with it because they had been so terrified by what transpired. They were just willing to sign off to the government and let them do whatever they wanted to do. The same thing happened in the case of COVID, where people were instilled with this incredible fear of death from the very beginning. So if they turned on the television, they saw ticker tapes of death going across the screen constantly for months and months. We saw this. And people who are locked in their homes, all they thought about was death. And they actually had no context for this. Like, people die every day, but people had no idea how many people actually die every day, how many elderly people were dying every day before COVID. And so this really frightened people. They were constantly afraid that they were subject to, death by virus. And so they got onto the whole COVID company bandwagon and decided to support all of the government's policies, no matter what they did. So what's really interesting structurally, when I say there's a time-tested template here, is that you have the identical architecture. So you have a small group of people who maybe have some sort of program. So for example, the neocons in 2002, a small group of people who had been plotting to go after Saddam Hussein for years, for decades, they found an opportunity where they could put forth their program and they could get the support of people. So the people who support are, in some ways, just as important. So there are the mercenary opportunists who stand to gain a lot of money through it because they're enriched by the policy itself. So you have that in war with war profiteers, with the privatization of many military services, and that made the military industrial complex much bigger and much more ramifying in all different directions. And the same thing happened in COVID. There were actors who stood to gain a lot of money, particularly in pharma and the medical industries. But also there were some, other things that you could profit from. For example, the tracking apps, the bizarre stickers that you saw everywhere, all that stuff. These were all ways that people could profit from the pandemic. So those are the opportunists. So you have the small group of people who have some sort of agenda that they want to push. Then you have the big group of mercenary opportunists who want to profit from the crisis. And then you have the third, and in fact, most important component, which is the populace who are persuaded to believe that they are acting good or right in supporting the government in whatever they do.
Yeah, and this is the exact same kind of playbook that they used really after the terror attacks in 9/11. The entire country was told to hang their American flags up, and whatever the Bush administration said we were going to do in the Middle East, we had to get behind him and rally behind him for our defense. Like, it's the exact same kind of logic there, right?
It is, and I think that if there's a silver lining to COVID, is that it's that we can learn from this experience how to understand what goes on when leaders call for war. And I believe that this template is probably going to be whipped out and used again in the what appears to be the emerging climate crisis. So if you can watch out, they're like red flags. They're doing a lot of media coverage of this. They're changing the colors of their maps, where red used to be 30 degrees Celsius or higher. No, it's like 20 degrees Celsius or higher. And so you can watch this, like with the amount of attention that the media is giving to climate, I have a feeling that they're going to try to enact some radical program and get the populace behind it. So it could be what Biden has already stated. He said that he's open to this experimental project of spraying these atmosphere with tons of medical particles to dim the sun. That sounds on its face, it sounds like a totally crazy idea. But I think if you frighten people enough in the way that we saw was done post 9/11 and also with the emergence of the COVID virus, if you frighten people enough, they will actually sign on to this, even though it sounds totally crazy and we have no idea what the side effects will be or the consequences. And in all of these cases, what you find is the populace, once the populace agrees to go along with whatever it is, then when at the end of the day, all of the damage is assessed, the people responsible just wipe their hands of it and move on. So George W. Bush went back home and started painting portraits. Okay, he killed a bunch of people, but he meant well. So he meant well. And so the same with COVID. No one's taking responsibility for the excess deaths during COVID, for all of the really destructive policies which gutted the middle class and destroyed millions of businesses. No one's taking responsibility for any of this, even though they were political decisions which drove people to poverty in many cases. So the same thing could happen in the climate crisis. And I think we need to be aware and alert to the possibility of this happening again, because if we allow these mad scientists to do things that are going to have really devastating effects on us in the future, it's on us. I mean, we have to bear the consequences if it goes awry. So you try to dim the sun. What are the side effects of that going to be? So that's a completely different topic, but I just want to show how this time-tested template I'm talking about is applicable to other areas as well.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. The slogan that was used over and over again during the pandemic was the slogan of trust the science. And it's the exact same one that they're rolling out right now to try to justify all of their climate policies. We have to believe the science. And you deal with that slogan in your book head on. And I really appreciate that you interact with the work of Thomas Kuhn, because I've done an episode on the structures of scientific revolution on my show before. And he's been, his book, I think, is excellent in terms of understanding how science actually works. And a lot of Americans are just completely ignorant about how the scientific method actually generates data. So talk to us about the slogan, trust the science, because this is definitely one of those templates that they rolled out during COVID. Everyone just accepted it. And I think that our society, if we don't learn our lessons from COVID, will continue to accept that slogan. What's wrong with trust the science?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. That was one of the first essays I wrote. It was chapter 4. It's the title was slightly modified, so it sounds a little bit provocative. I think it says the intellectual fraud of listening to the science. This essay provoked so much anger from people, probably more anger than any other of my essays. And it was so strange to watch, because people thought that I was saying somehow you shouldn't listen to science, you shouldn't do science, you shouldn't believe in science. So I don't know what exactly they thought I was saying in that essay. Most of them didn't actually read it, but the title turned them off so much they became very angry with me. So the points are very simple. One is the Thomas Kuhnian point, which is that human beings are scientists. Okay, so human beings have values and interests and beliefs, and they're fallible. All of these things are part of what it is to be a scientist, in addition to being supposedly objective and rational. So scientists have interests and they want to defend their theory. As Thomas Kuhn pointed out, they will hold on to their theory. They will even, in some cases, hold on religiously to their theory in the face of refractory evidence because they want to believe that is true. So that's the Thomas Kuhnian point. He felt that there was a kind of mob psychology involved in theory construction. So you couldn't necessarily believe that because a theory was currently popular, that it really reflected the truth. So you always have to keep an open mind. So Thomas Kuhn, it's not like he was against science. He was just a realist about the human beings who do science. Okay, so that's that point. But you can even set aside Thomas Kuhn's concerns and you can say, well, in the end, it works out because people have interest in different directions. And so it's going to get kind of ironed out. In the end, the truth will emerge through science. So science is actually just a method for adjudicating various hypotheses. It's kind of like a competition. So one scientist has one hypothesis, another one has another, and then you figure out which one best accounts for the data, which one best explains the data. And the one that can give the most satisfying explanation of what's going on is the one that people embrace as true. So this means that science is a process, and the deliverances of science change over time. We know this. Many theories have changed a lot. Okay, so the problem with the slogan, "Listen to the science," is that it suggests that scientists actually have some sort of normative wisdom, that they can tell you what you should do based on the deliverances of science. In fact, this is a logical fallacy. It's called the is-ought fallacy. Scottish philosopher David Hume is famous for discussing it. And what he says is basically, description does not imply anything for normative action or prescription. So you can know all the facts, but then there's a whole nother question of what you should do. What you should do is not dictated by the facts at all. That's a whole different question. So examples I give at the end of that chapter are the fact that the virus exists does not imply that you should be enrolling children who are invulnerable to the virus in experimental medication trials. Okay, so that's a question. You might think that you should do that, but it's actually open to debate. It doesn't follow from the fact that the virus exists. So what you should do is a separate question from what is the fact. So you can agree on the facts. The virus exists, it's out there, but then there's the whole other debate to be had, which is what should we do? So the people like Fauci who are saying, listen to the science, were basically saying, listen to me, do whatever I say. So I stand for the science, and if you disagree with me, you're attacking the scientific enterprise. As crazy as that sounds, he really said this in one of his interviews. He said, if you're attacking Anthony Fauci, you're attacking the science. So this betrays a complete failure to understand the distinction between description and prescription. And it also mistakes the perversion of science, which is scientism, with science. Okay, science is an open dialogue where you have to constantly consider new data and revise your theories in the face of refractory data, or even reject your theory if it no longer accounts for the data. So that's the process of science. When you stop having dialogues and discussions, you're no longer doing science. And that's what Fauci tried to do. He tried to shut down dissent by censoring people who had divergent opinions from his own. So that, in and of itself, the fact that he wanted to censor people who disagreed with him shows that he wasn't doing science. He, in fact, erected a kind of cult following of people who wanted to do whatever he said. It didn't matter. He was the source of the truth, according to them. These were mainly people who have no background in science, and so they felt helpless, and they wanted someone to guide them through the pandemic, and so they clung on to Anthony Fauci and did whatever he said. So when he said, you don't have to wear masks, they didn't wear a mask. When he said, you have to wear a mask, they did wear a mask. When he said, actually, you should wear double masks, they wore a double mask. So they did whatever he said because they wanted to follow someone who knew what they were doing. They felt completely helpless and like they didn't know what was doing. And most of all, they didn't want to die. They had been pervasively propagandized to believe that they would die if they did not do what the expert told them to do.
Yeah, and I think that it was that fear and paranoia that drove a lot of people to make those terrible decisions during the pandemic, and people just didn't learn from that because a lot of people I don't think have ever been taught to think about science or in really any of these major issues philosophically before. It's essentially science in the Western world means objectivity, it means truth, and that's as you've been saying, just not the case. You also come back to the idea that, and we discussed it already a little bit before, that during the pandemic, the military-industrial complex framework was used to impose all of these policies on the population. And the term that you use and correctly describe in your book is the medical industrial complex. That's the kind of the situation that we're dealing with in terms of COVID policy and all of the incentives that are tied up with that. So the medical industrial complex was the driving force behind pandemic policy. What exactly is the medical industrial complex, and why is it such a problem, especially considering that it was the people that were wrapped up in this medical industrial complex that were pushing the lie that we had to believe the science all throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, it's very similar to what happens in times of military conflict. So you have a group of people who stand to profit handsomely from certain types of policies, and they push those policies very hard on politicians. The lobbyists try to get politicians to agree with them. There are many, many lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for a reason, because they cajole lawmakers into promoting, for example, wars or health policies. In the case of the medical industrial complex, what has happened is that the regulatory agencies, such as the CDC, Centers for Disease, and the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, they've been essentially captured by the pharmaceutical industry at this point. So they've infiltrated the regulatory agencies, pharma has, in the way that military industry has infiltrated the apparatus that decides what our foreign policy should be. So you have the same sort of structure where people who stand to benefit are actually determining policy, and they're changing the definitions, and they're changing the rules of engagement or the rules of application or the prescriptions for what public health officials ask people to do. So I would say that the best example of this comes from the opioid crisis, which actually emerged as a result of this regulatory capture. So, as you are no doubt aware, narcotics are extremely addictive, and people have been aware of this for many, many centuries. But what happened in the late 20th century is that some players in pharma persuaded regulatory folks at the FDA to not only approve a very powerful narcotic drug, OxyContin, as safe for general use, not just for terminally ill patients, but they also allowed them to include what ended up being marketing material, which is a little insert which stated that the medication was not really addictive and it wasn't subject to abuse. So what happened from there is that normal clinicians who they take their guidance from these supposed authorities. Okay, so a clinician sees patients and bases his prescriptions on what he has been told by people who do research. And so he obviously trusts the FDA. So if the FDA tells a physician that this narcotic is not addictive, he's not going to be afraid to prescribe it, even though in the past he may not have prescribed narcotics to his patients because he knows they're going to become addicts. So what happened with the opioid crisis is that lots of doctors were hoodwinked into believing through a massive marketing campaign by pharma that it was now okay to prescribe narcotics for just about anything to anyone. And so what happened is a lot of people discovered that they were addicts when they got to the bottom of their big amber vial. And some of them lost their jobs. And because they lost their jobs, they lost their insurance. And because medication was so expensive, they couldn't pay for it themselves. So they either turned to the streets, or initially they turned to pain clinics, which were mounted by mercenary physicians who teamed up with businessmen, and basically they allowed people to come in, say, oh, my back hurts, and then write them a prescription. People would doctor shop and get tons of narcotics. They would divert them, sell them on the street to pay for their own, living expenses and also for their own habit. So this went on for a while, creating lots and lots of addicts. And when it was shut down, all these addicts just turned to the streets. And that was the origin of the fentanyl crisis, because people drug dealers, moved in to fill the market demand, and that's why we have a fentanyl crisis right now. It's not the case, like people are trying to act like the Mexican cartels caused the fentanyl crisis. No, actually it was pharma which caused the opioid crisis. So I think this is analogous to what happens with the military, because we just, for example, left Afghanistan in 2021 after supposedly trying to democratize it for 20 years, and people just went along with it because they were kind of in a trance after 9/11. They just like signed off on foreign policy. The people in charge could do whatever they wanted. And they didn't really notice that, we actually just left Afghanistan. Taliban's back in charge again. So that means we killed all those people for actually no reason. We didn't change their society in any way, which was the pretext for staying there after Osama bin Laden was gone, right? We stayed there for another 10 years. And people are like, they just don't discuss like what exactly happened and how we managed to lose a war to the ragtag Taliban. Instead, they just pivot swiftly and say, we have to start shipping arms to Ukraine. So now we're involved in a proxy war, which could actually lead, to the end of human civilization. But people are still in this trance. Habits, they're inured to this delegation of foreign policy responsibility to a handful of people who have very strong financial interests at stake.
One of the things I really appreciate about your book is that it is laid out in chronological order. So this collection of essays starts back at the beginning in 2020 and goes all the way to some essays that you wrote earlier in 2023. And I love the way that unfolds, because as I was reading it, you talk about a lot of the ways that the government responded to the pandemic. And it was a good reminder for me of exactly what I was going through as the pandemic unfolded. And a lot of the response to the pandemic by the government was actually setting up big pharma to make lots and lots of profit. So we know that, and those were just the regulations that benefited pharma. There were so many egregious policies that were enacted by governments all over the world during the pandemic. What are some of the worst that you chronicle in your book, and why did these governments persist in promoting them for so long, even after we kind of knew as a society, based on the data, that these policies weren't working as intended?
Well, part of it becomes an exercise in proving that politicians were not wrong. So a good example are the lockdowns. So when the lockdowns were imposed and they didn't cause the virus to go away, the response on the part of politicians was not like, lockdowns were a bad idea. Instead, they doubled down and made the lockdowns worse and longer, and they threatened their populace with, even ever more severe lockdowns if the virus didn't go away. So they wanted to blame someone else for the virus. So the politicians didn't want to say, our policies are bad. So they instead started blaming the people who supposedly weren't complying with their policies and said, look, this is why it didn't work. So we're going to lock you down even harder. So this went on and on. It was this blame game. I saw it in all the countries I was in, where the leaders would be finger wagging against their populace, like, you're naughty. The reason why the virus didn't go away is because you didn't really lock down. You were actually out consorting with your friends or whatever. So they tried to blame the populace. And so that explains part of the reason for the extended lockdowns. I mean, there's no real explanation for the fact that the United States was closed to unvaccinated people until May 11th, 2023. That's just inertia. That's just deference on the part of the Democratic Party, I suppose, to the executive to say we support you. It's some sort of solidarity among the politicians. Like, no one's going to take responsibility, and we're going to just pretend that our policies worked. So you'll see this over and over again. Even people like Trump, they continue to tout the virtues of the vaccine when it's fairly clear that they don't really work. So they don't want to take responsibility. They don't want to admit defeat, and they want to take credit for the survival of everyone who didn't die. So even though you probably had nearly no chance of dying from COVID, they want to take credit for your ongoing survival. So that's a big part of it. It's the human tendency to shirk responsibility, but particularly on the part of politicians and bureaucrats, they don't want to take any responsibility. And you see this in war all the time. Like, no one takes responsibility after the fact. They say, we meant to do well, and that's all that matters anymore. That our intention was good. So, mistakes were made. Cuomo sent sick elderly people into nursing homes in New York City and killed thousands of people, but he meant well. He meant to do well.
And that's the exact same framework that the government uses to justify all of their mistakes, more it's collateral damage. We were trying to do the right thing. Yep. Sometimes innocent people have to get killed in order to protect people. And this is kind of the narrative that they have been promoting in terms of their COVID policies, that there might have been some negative externalities, but on net, it was a positive. But I know, because I'm a teacher and I work with a lot of people in the public all the time, that these policies had a massive amount of collateral damage. And there are a ton of families who were destroyed and overdosed. There are all kinds of problems that were a result of these disastrous COVID policies. So talk to us about some of the collateral damage that might have actually been more costly than the virus itself.
Okay, I think probably the worst public health decision of all was refusing to treat people who weren't suffering from COVID. So thousands and thousands of early diagnoses of cancer were missed. And people who had minor strokes didn't go to the hospital either because they had been, terrorized into believing they're going to come into contact and die of COVID, or because the health officials themselves would not treat people if they were not vaccinated. So those are going to be long range effects that we see for years to come, where people are dying earlier than they might have because their cancer was not, or their other, debility was not caught early on. We're going to have to wait to see more on the data on heart trouble and myocarditis, because it looks like the vaccines themselves may have caused a huge amount of damage, especially to young people. This was not detected early on because when the vaccines were first distributed, they were given to elderly people who are prone to heart disease. So this didn't show up in their early data because they figured, you're 80, you have a heart attack. That's like a normal thing to do. It's not a normal thing for a 15-year-old to have a heart attack or to have a very severe heart crisis. And so once young people started being inoculated, they started noticing this myocarditis problem and the blood clotting and probably these strokes on the part of athletes that you're seeing more and more. So that's going to have to be sorted out. That's a direct vaccine side effect. And these were denied from the very beginning. News about the possibility of side effects was suppressed, as we know from the Twitter files and some of the correspondence that's now becoming public. And the logic in their minds was utilitarian. They thought, okay, so, we're going to not spread the news about these true stories of vaccine injury because on the whole, we want to promote vaccine uptake. There will be a small number of outlier people who get hurt by the vaccines, but we'll actually save more lives by promoting universal vaccine uptake. So that was their logic. Of course, they were wrong because this disease was not lethal to most people. Okay, so the survivability rate of this disease for most people was, above 99%. So, they were conducting themselves in many cases as though this were the Black Plague, as though this were a disease that you had a 99.5% chance of dying from. So it's like the numbers got inverted. So people treated in their public policies, they treated it as though it was going to kill everyone, when in fact, nearly everyone was always going to survive. So I would say that drove the hospital administrators to prohibit patients from coming in who had non-COVID ailments, and that is going to cause a lot of death in the end. But another not necessarily medical mistake were the lockdowns themselves. So people were forbidden from working. They lost their businesses. You can see this in every city in the United States, all the shuttered stores that were closed forever. And everyone in the gig economy was really harmed by the lockdowns because they were forbidden from working. It wasn't like they were lazy and people, small entrepreneurs lost their businesses. They had invested their whole life into starting this business and it was just crushed. So all of that wealth was shifted to the big box stores, Amazon, Walmart, and then these people in the middle class, the sort of small magnitude entrepreneurs, they were harmed the greatest by this economic policy.
Yeah, I mean, it was like one of the largest transfers of wealth from the middle class to the upper class in history. And a lot of people that are very progressive and that care about, or at least they say that they care about the distribution of wealth, just completely miss that. And a lot of these policies were driven by data that was produced by organizations like the CDC, the NIH, and the NIAID. But over time, that data continued to change, and the recommendations that these organizations made continued to change. And in hindsight, as you addressed in your book, a lot of the data that justified these government policies of lockdowns was based on very bad information. So what were some of the major social consequences of the bad data that was produced by these organizations that resulted from the failures of the public health establishment to maybe do the scientific research in a way that it is consistent with a scientific method?
Well, I mean, I think, they talk about the mental health crisis. A lot of people were distraught by what went on. And certainly the prescriptions for antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications and SSRIs, those all went up. So this was like another coup for pharma. So you traumatize people enough and they're going to go to their family doctor and say, please give me some relief, So they're taking those prescription pills. So even more, it was 25% of Americans on psych meds, but now it's probably like 35% or even higher because people were so distraught. They just wanted some relief. And so that's one. But even worse, of course, are the people who turned to street drugs, many of which were fentanyl laced and ended up dying. Some of these people were not even addicts, but they got some sort of, black market drug that was laced with fentanyl or had too much fentanyl in it. Fentanyl is incredibly powerful and, in fact, toxic, and they died. So there's been a complete epidemic of drug overdoses, and I firmly believe that this was caused in part by the lockdowns. People who were not allowed to work and who were distraught and they were in financial and psychological dire straits, they turned to the street for drugs. And, the people who lost their homes were among them. And you can see this in the tent encampments all over the United States. When I traveled over the United States over the last couple of years, I was shocked. I mean, I had lived in these places before. I had lived in Denver. I had lived in Salt Lake City. I had lived in Los Angeles, and I was shocked at the transformation of these cities. I mean, they look like third world countries. You walk down these major urban areas, and it's just, there are zombies, who are on some kind of really powerful synthetic drugs. And you can see pictures of Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia, for example. And it's actually frightening. When I was in Los Angeles, I was there for a couple days, and there were like crazy people walking around the streets, like screaming because they're either out of their minds on drugs or they're just out of their minds, period. And there's so much filth. So I would say that is a big consequence of what happened. People were just devastated economically, and then they had nowhere to turn. So they weren't provided with any support from the government. People who were kind of sort of in the system got like a couple checks for like $1,200. But even that is almost a joke if you look at the price of rents in the United States. So if you're an urban dweller, that covered like maybe 2 weeks or maybe a week, like really, right. if you're in an urban place. So that was kind of a joke. And if you compare the United States economic rescue packages to those of other countries, the U.S. really just padded the pockets of pharma and these big businesses and just left people to fend for themselves. So, and it still goes on. I mean, like, we continue to send billions of dollars to Ukraine, and all these people are like dying in the streets. And it's almost like, oh, we care more about, the people of Ukraine than the people of the United States. How does that work?
Right. Yeah. So why do you think the CDC and the NIH have so much institutional power within the medical kind of decision-making process in the United States? Like, what gives them more authority than your non-government connected scientists and doctors?
Well, they're supposedly the regulatory agencies. And as I said, clinicians look to them for authoritative information. So their assumption is that these people are giving them the latest scientific, news and advice. And so they implement those policies, and it just trickles down all the way. So the reason why they have so much policy, or so much power, is that people believe in them, and they continue to believe in them. So even though after the story I just laid out regarding the origins of the opioid crisis, even after that, you saw Rochelle Walensky and Anthony Fauci going out on national television saying the FDA is the gold standard So when they were pitching the vaccine, they wanted to assure everyone that it was safe and effective, even though it only got emergency use authorization, because the FDA is the gold standard. Well, anyone who knew about the history of the opioid crisis knows exactly what happened there, and was with reason skeptical about this claim that these are some sort of magical panacea. It turned out they weren't a panacea, and it was a incredible propagandistic public marketing campaign to try to inject every single person in the country with this drug. And you started to recognize the fissures in the story when they did things like pretended like natural immunity didn't have any relevance to your decision of whether to take a vaccine. That's when things started getting really crazy. When they pretended that natural immunity had no relevance, then you knew something was off. I mean, that's a contradiction, because the vaccines work by provoking your own immune system to respond to the presence of an invader. That's exactly how a vaccine works. So if your immune system doesn't work, then no vaccine is going to work. It's a logical contradiction. You can't say that a vaccine will save you if herd immunity is impossible. And people didn't recognize this because they're just ignorant, and they didn't really think through, they weren't struck by the contradictions that were being hurled at them, partly because they were so afraid. In a state of fear, you just lose your critical bearings and you just say, whatever, I just want it to end. I'll do whatever they say. And so what happened as the crisis evolved was that the compliant people started blaming the non-compliant people and getting really angry with them. And we had this phrase, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So we had a real division, a polarization of people. And this is another thing that happens during wartime. You have the good people and the evil people, and you're either with us or you're against us. And so there was a huge amount of demonization of people who refused to accept what I call the COVID company line. So even though a lot of these people had already recovered from COVID, so they had perfectly sound grounds for declining an experimental treatment for a disease which they just recovered from. I mean, there was nothing unscientific about their decisions not to roll up their sleeves.
No conversation about the pandemic would be complete without discussing Anthony Fauci and his role in the pandemic. And so he's the head of the National Institutes for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the NIAID, and he became kind of the America's top doctor. And in a lot of ways, in 2020 and 2021, he really was one of the most powerful people in the entire world. So you talk about it in your book, and I know we both read RFK's book, The Real Anthony Fauci, and you kind of talk, which dives into the history of his tenure at the NIAID. So how did Anthony Fauci become such a powerful figure? What has been his history in the 40 or so, 35 years that he's been involved in government? And why was he such a powerful figure during the COVID pandemic? Like what was the mechanism by which he became the spokesperson for our government's COVID policy?
Well, as you know, he's the most highly paid federal employee in history. Yeah, you may know that. Okay, and then you know from reading Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s book that he had a long history with the AIDS crisis and developing medications and testing medications for that. So that book is really very devastating, and I would recommend everyone read it so they get the backstory on Anthony Fauci and how he climbed the ladder to success to become the top public health official, to become America's doctor, as they called him. And he climbed up the ladder through basically promoting pharma all the way along. So basically, he climbed the ladder to success by doing what he needed to do to further the interests of the pharma industry. And at the end, to explain why he was appointed like the number one guru, it was mainly because people wanted a guru. So they needed someone. Trump didn't have any medical knowledge. So we had the top guy at the CDC. If anyone knows what's going on, it's got to be the top guy at the CDC. So they just appointed him, and he became the go-to person. And he did a massive news media blitz constantly. It was like continuous. He was on TV almost every single day, and he just became the person that people trusted. because he held this position, and he obviously knew much more about science than most people, and people just wanted to believe. Above all, they wanted a guru. They wanted someone to guide them through the pandemic, and Anthony Fauci was that guy.
And what did he get wrong during the pandemic?
What did he get right?
Well, yeah, actually, that's probably a better way of putting it. Yeah. Did he get anything right? Or why was he able to persist in being wrong for so long?
Yeah, I mean, this is all going to come out in the end, but the denouement of my book is the penultimate chapter where I discuss this article he published in January 2023, which is so unbelievable because what it asserts is that viruses such as the COVID-19 virus and the flu viruses and common cold viruses and lots of viruses in this class mutate so rapidly that you can never have an effective vaccine against them. So what I argue in that chapter is that either he knew this back in 2020 and he just pretended to have optimism about this great panacea, this great pharmaceutical cure for COVID, or he didn't know it. So if he didn't know it, then he had really no business serving as our public health authority, because he didn't know things that, you know, everyday virologists knew back in 2020. They were silenced when they said it. When they tried to say it back in 2020, they were all censored and deplatformed and called quacks. But this was common knowledge, because they had tried to devise, to formulate vaccines against the common cold for years. And of course, as you may know, the flu shot is very mediocre. So there is a flu shot, and it ranges in efficacy each year from like 19 or 18% to 48%. So more than half the people who take the flu shot are not helped by it at all. That doesn't stop pharma from marketing it as though it's 100% cure, and that you are just like stupid if you don't get your free flu shot at Walgreens. That's how they market it. But the truth is, if you look at the data, it's not very successful. And Anthony Fauci explains why. It's because the flu virus mutates so rapidly that your body never mounts an effective and permanent response to it. Basically, it gets it out of your system and then moves on. So you don't elicit a really powerful response to these sorts of viruses because they're not typically deadly. So you just get it out of your system and then you move on. So that's why you can get a different flu every single year. And it doesn't matter whether you take the flu shot or not, because the flu shot from this year has no bearing on most variants of the flu and none on next year's, variants in all likelihood. So basically this incredible article, which came out, it's a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It came out in January 2023 and it's co-authored by Anthony Fauci. And it looks like on its face, he's admitting defeat. You can't actually have an effective permanent vaccine solution to COVID-19. This has not stopped the CDC from recommending the addition of the COVID vaccine and all future boosters to the childhood immunization formulary. So they've added this to the list of, it's something like 70 shots that kids are supposed to get. And it's crazy because it means that children are being asked to take not only the original COVID-19 shot, when they're 6 months old, but also every subsequent booster. So what that means is that children have been set up to serve as guinea pigs for their entire childhood, because every single booster shot is actually an experimental trial. So although Anthony Fauci himself has stated that you can't have a permanent vaccine solution to COVID-19 in the way that you can for measles and polio and a lot of these other really powerful and very lethal diseases, he nonetheless managed to get this onto the formulary for child immunization. Now, you might say, well, why would you do that? And there, of course, as usual, is a financial incentive, and that is that any medication which makes it onto the child immunization schedule is protected in perpetuity from lawsuits. So you can't sue, as long as something is on that list, you can't sue the manufacturer for your adverse effects. And if your spouse dies as a result of injection, you can't sue, for damages. So it's very sneaky and really unbelievable. There are two reasons for getting it onto the schedule. One is to have like a fresh supply of arms for experimenting, with more and more of these mRNA vaccines. And the other one is to prevent the companies from ever being sued. So this is how Anthony Fauci made it to the top, by doing this kind of stuff. So even when it's shown that, and he has admitted that you can't have a permanent vaccine solution, I argue he pivots to fail forward and promote even more pharmaceutical products from being sold, because you have to have boosters every year. So now you have to have booster after booster after booster after booster. It's a major cash cow for pharma.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And we know that very powerful people are almost never held accountable for their actions. I think I would say that every single president in my lifetime is a war criminal, and they should all be thrown in prison. None of them will ever be prosecuted for war crimes. They might get Donald Trump on a technicality or whatever, but they're not going to go back and prosecute Obama or Bush for what they did,
Right.
With
Good
Anthony
call.
Fauci, I mean, he very clearly lied to the Senate. And like my own senator, Rand Paul, it was so satisfying to watch him grill Fauci and see Fauci backtrack on all of his statements. I mean, he obviously lied under oath before Congress, but there doesn't seem to be, except for a handful of people, any real desire to see him prosecuted. Do you think that there's a legitimate criminal case for somebody like Anthony Fauci? And do you think that there is the political will to actually give him a real consequence for his decision making during the pandemic?
Well, there absolutely is a criminal case. I mean, I think that the post-COVID world is a crime scene. Absolutely. All the people who were coerced into taking shots that harmed them permanently, those people were wronged and they were deceived. So they did not... There was no informed consent going on because they didn't have full information, and a lot of these people were coerced. So it wasn't informed consent, a complete violation of the Nuremberg Code against non-consensual human experimentation. So I absolutely think that there's a criminal case. Now, whether there's the political will, it seems doubtful, because the very people who go along with these policies are the ones who have been cajoled by pharma lobbyists. So those are the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. And so they're the ones who would have to mount the case against him. And they're few and far between who have not been co-opted by pharma already. So these people get reelected over and over again because they form friendships with lobbyists, not only in pharma, but also in the military industrial complex. And so that's why we have these permanent legislators, people who should have retired long ago. We've seen Mitch McConnell recently have a stroke, apparently, in real time. And Dianne Feinstein, you've seen her. These people are barely functional, and yet they're still occupying these offices and basically just voting for whatever their pharma friends and their military friends want them to vote for. So it's really sad, and they're not going to hold Fauci accountable in any event, because Fauci has been the number one most successful promoter of pharmaceutical quote unquote cures of them all. So pharma has become an incredibly powerful force since really the launch of Prozac, which was 1987, 1988. And it's gotten worse and worse over the years. And so now what we saw in COVID was pharma not only trying to persuade doctors to prescribe you things, but trying to persuade, and successfully, governments to coerce you to take their products. So this is, I call this, what did I say this? My chapter is called The Pharma Revolution is Being Televised. And I call this the fourth stage in the pharma revolution, where they've gone beyond trying to persuade doctors or patients through direct-to-consumer advertising, which has been done in the United States since 1997, to actually getting a seat at the table with government officials and persuading them to force their products on their population. And that's very, very frightening. They have so much power that they have managed to succeed in this endeavor in many countries. So a lot of countries required their citizens to get vaccinated on pain of fines or, other criminal penalties for failure to do so, even though these shots didn't really work. So that's really frightening that they have this power, and we have to be wary. That's why I call this a cautionary tale. We have to be wary as we see signs of this taking place again in the future.
All right, guys, that concludes the first half of my interview with Laurie Calhoun on her new book, Questioning the COVID Company Line. Next week, tune back in because you are not going to want to miss the second half. We get into some of the more controversial aspects. They were all controversial, but we get into some of the really controversial aspects of the COVID pandemic, including the efficacy of the vaccines and the origins of COVID-19, as well as discussing the pharmaceutical companies and legislation that has promoted and supported them over the previous years. So you are absolutely not going to want to miss next week's episode. Thanks again for listening to the end of the show, and I'll see you all next Tuesday for the second half of my conversation with Laurie Calhoun. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.